Hello, can we hear me? How are we doing? Welcome to the first ever EPP live stream. I'm very glad to all the people who've joined us, and I'm hoping that you can hear me all okay. If you do hear me okay, can you please comment down below just to let me know, and we'll start from there. I'm going to assume that you hear me okay. I don't see any protest. So before we get into the event and I introduce our host, I thought I'd first start by thanking our many co-hosts. We are co-hosting today with the KCL European Society, the UCL Democracy in Action Society, UCL International Relations Society, and I'd also like to make a thank to Matvey Ganopolsky for hosting and sharing us. Just to explain a little bit about our organization and our goals, we were a company that's been recently established. We were established last month during the peak of the coronavirus pandemic. We realized that there was an acute need for political webinars on a neutral platform, especially in this post-COVID era. As we go in to the new academic year, new university year, all the same privileges, all the same luxuries that we once had will not exist. We won't be able to hold normal events. So we need to innovate and we need to encourage new discourse to take place online on these seminars, and we hope to plug the gap on this. We are a completely not-for-profit organization. We're registered in the United Kingdom, and we run solely on donations. So I might quickly flash up on our screen our donation link, which should appear here. We run purely on donations, and all your money will go into the raising funds for new speakers, for covering the costs of our daily use. So that'd be very much appreciated if for any donations that we could receive. I won't dally too much in introducing our speaker, who is Ilya Ponomarev. I will allow himself to introduce himself, but he is a man who is very well known in Russian circles and very controversial potentially, depending on who you ask, but he's definitely an innovator. He is a businessman, he is a politician, he was crucial in opposition to the 2014 vote on the annexation of Crimea. So without any further ado, I shall introduce Ilya. Ilya, can you hear me?
Hello everyone, and thank you very much for your
hello,
kind
Ilya.
introduction.
Hi. No, not a problem, not a problem. So I wanted to start maybe by, how would you describe yourself? If you're going to describe yourself to a Western audience who may have never heard of you before, what would you say your role has been in the last few years?
I would describe myself as an honest man.
An honest man. An honest man in a country where maybe that is there is a shortage in the Duma currently.
It's a rare commodity, unfortunately, in our politics, and I think that it's in general in politics, it's a kind of rare commodity, and that's why all the controversy that you were talking about.
Oh, well, potentially. I would also like to say that you are not currently filming from Russia right now. Do you want to maybe explain a bit about why you were filming from abroad and you're joining us from your home outside of Russia today?
Yes, I'm right now in Washington, D.C., but I think that the reason is pretty simple. It's because of the bloody virus and the quarantine measures. So I got stuck here in the United States. But in general, my main living base currently is Kiev, Ukraine. That's where I spend most of my time. Although I am shuttling back and forth between the United States and Ukraine because I have a pretty prominent investment company which specializes on natural resources with a primary focus on Eastern Europe and Ukraine, but that's a US company with US investors. That's actually the first company which went public on NASDAQ from our part of the world, which I am very proud of this achievement. It happened in 2018, and so that's why I am shuttling between East Coast and Ukraine.
I understand. Brilliant. Well, I'm going to dive into the first main question that I wanted to ask you, and I think this is quite a controversial point. In your eyes, do you believe there is a Russian opposition as of 2020?
That's the most difficult question, probably, that you can ask me. To my mind, the answer is the following. There is no opposition. Because opposition assumes to be a political force. a politically aligned organization with common goals, common vision, common platform, common leaders. None of that exists. But obviously, there are a lot of opposition-minded people in Russia, and some of them are very prominent and decent. Some of them are not that much, and I wanted to explain here is because there are different kinds of opposition forces in the country. If you look, for example, into the Russian parliament, in the State Duma, you would also see opposition parties. But they call themselves the system opposition, so that means that they are in the opposition to economic policies of the government, but they are not opposition towards the political system that was created by Mr. Putin. And that's why a lot of people say that it's a fake opposition, but it's the opposition nonetheless, as they are not supporting what the government is doing.
Do you believe sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Do you believe then that a true opposition would come from popular support? We saw back about 5 or 10 years ago, we had a very strange alliance between liberal opposition in Russia and even as far as monarchists and nationalists. There was a platform that was shared, and that was done on a kind of popular vote. Do you reckon we have to move back towards this popular-led movement of Russian opposition?
That's exactly the point. Is when people vote, they vote from the certain menu, which is allowed to be in the ballots. And currently, there are forces which are allowed to be in the ballot. Those guys from system opposition, they are allowed to be in the ballots. And basically, they have the different flavors in there. They have liberals, llya political party. They have social democrats, Справедливая Россия, or the Fair Russia political party. They have nationalists, which ironically are called Liberal Democratic Party, and they have communists, which are called Communist Party of Russia Federation. But the question is that the communists are not communists, the Liberal Democrats are not Liberal Democrats, Social Democrats are not Social Democrats, so it's all confused. And it's all very much the imitation of the public policies, very much the imitation of electoral process. But from the other side, we have the other flank of the opposition, which is this non-system opposition. And among non-system opposition, we also have these different flavors. So we have liberals, they mostly right-wing neoliberals, which has a strong presence in the non-system opposition ranks. Then we have also leftists, the genuine leftists, true ones, usually pretty radical. And also we have two different types of nationalists. We have ethnical nationalists, which call it for Russia for Russians. To my mind, very fascist in the way they sound. But also there are imperialist nationalists, which are calling for the greater Russian state, restoration of empire, and there you would find all those monarchists which dream of the restoration of the Tsarist regime and the strong country, etc., etc., etc. And say among nationalists, they also are very much anti-Putin. But the bulk of imperialist nationalists, for example, they were fighting along with Russian military forces in Donbass against Ukraine, while, for example, ethnical nationalists were fighting on the Ukrainian side because their position was Ukraine for Ukrainians, Russia for Russians.
And now
so it's all very confused and fragmented.
And now that effectively in Russia, there's legislation has been passed which effectively prohibits public demonstrations, what limits does this put on a non-system opposition if you cannot manifest openly and you cannot lead popular movements?
Well, you see, there is also this ongoing and permanent debate among the non-system opposition ranks whether we should participate only in the sanctioned allowed rallies or whether we have to go to the streets, without any sanctions, because yes, the Russian legislation, the current Russian legislation, requires you to get a permit from the government to go to protest on the streets. And that's, of course, it's ridiculous when you are in the opposition to ask the guys whom you are protesting against for a permit. But from the other side, the practice shows that when it's an allowed, a permitted action, then it obviously gathers way larger crowd than when it's a radical protest against the rules. But currently, the weight is more and more shifting towards this illegal, permitted actions, and I think it's both logical and kind of helpful to strengthen the opposition ranks.
And what groups would you say are most vocal in this new anti-party style of Russian opposition?
Well, in terms of groups, I briefly mentioned them. So there are obviously leftists whom I have the most sympathies for myself, and they usually associated with either left front or left bloc political movements. They basically have the same ideological and social economic platform. They different only in their views on the Ukrainian conflict. Left front currently is taking the conflict as an attempt to restore Soviet Union, which they see as a great thing. And left bloc see that it's an imperialist attack on Ukraine, and it has not to be tolerated. They more are standing on the classical leftist position of the world without annexations and contributions that was proclaimed in 1915 during World War I by the majority of leftists at that time. On the liberal flank, the most prominent figure is Alexei Navalny, who is probably the most well recognized, and many media are trying to portray him as the opposition leader, which I don't believe it's true, and that's obviously what he wants to achieve by himself, but that's not how it's been recognized within the country. Then they have two other leaders in the same area, which is Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who is currently living in London and is chairing the political movement called Open Russia, which is a clear alternative to what Alexei Navalny is doing. Dmitry Gudkov, my very good friend, he was also coming from social democratic movement, but gradually shifted more to classical right-wing liberalism. Although I think that he is probably the most compromised and reasonable and promising figure to unite leftists and liberals. And then we have those nationalists, most of nationalist forces who were for Ukraine, against the war. They mostly already in jail. Because Kremlin thinks that it's a very dangerous thing. They are installing themselves this virus of nationalism among Russian people, and they don't want anybody to be able to capitalize on that in their political favor. That's why the figures of this ethnical nationalists, they were almost all sent to jail or forced to emigrate. And imperialist nationalists, these are people like Igor Girkin Strelkov, the ill-famous military commander, guerrilla fighter in Donbass, the guy who is one of the most responsible for people for this war that started with Ukraine, and he was declared by U.S. court as the one who is responsible for downing MH17 flight, the Malaysian airplane, which was shot down over Donbass in 2015.
I'd like to quickly ask you.
Also, Zahar Prilepin, which is another military commander in Donbass, but Girkin is very firmly anti-Putin type of guy. That's why Kremlin is also trying to push him into the shadows. They're afraid to touch him because he is a kind of war hero. But still they don't want him, and they try to construct a new legit political force which would run on the next upcoming Duma elections, which would be led by this other guy, Zahar Prilepin.
And something I wanted to ask, in Russia it is technically possible to be a member of the opposition, to be a non-party opposition, but however, there is a proviso that there are public safety, well, there's risks to your own safety, which come with running as an opposition figure. I just want to ask, what kind of harassment do opposition figures experience? And maybe from your own perspective, I understood that you potentially may have avoided some incidents in the past.
Well, obviously, this is something which is very serious for us. This is something that all people in the real opposition experience. I myself have more than a handful of my good friends and acquaintances murdered over last 5-6 years since the war with Ukraine started and all the brakes were lifted on the violence against the opposition. And there were very different people. For example, in the same Great Britain where you are currently, Alexander Litvinenko, who was my good friend, was assassinated. He was one of the early birds, so to say, of this violence. Obviously, everybody knows about Boris Nemtsov in Moscow. Also, quite high-profile case of Denis Voronenkov in Kiev, the former member of State Duma. But there are quite a number of less known people, mostly again from leftist or nationalist flanks, because they are seen by the authorities as way more dangerous for themselves, more dangerous than the liberals. Liberals, they think, would never have enough popular support within the country, so they allow themselves to exist, to kind of let the steam off. They have certain media which also are allowed, so it's kind of a certain like information bubble where they are contained, and that's more legit. But in general, Putin's take on this is that he hates people whom he recognizes as traitors. So in his eyes, say Litvinenko or Boris Nemtsov were traitors. Litvinenko or Skripal, by the way, they were intelligence military officers, and they kind of switched sides. So that means that they were even like officially traitors. Boris Nemtsov was one of the masterminds behind the early Putin era economic and social reforms. His political party was the main driver for main economic transformation initiatives that were happening in the first half of 2000s. And when he ended up being in the radical opposition, also for Putin, it was taken as that the guys switched sides. From other side, there are people who never did that. Say Alexei Venediktov, who is editor-in-chief and very well recognized, probably the leading liberal side journalist, editor-in-chief of Echo Moskvy, of Moscow radio station. He is a kind of this decent enemy. I think that I am still alive and safe very much for the same reason, because I was consistent in my political beliefs, and that's why I am not allowed in Russia. So Putin gave orders after my voting to neutralize me, but not exactly harm me.
And leads me to another question. This is quite a difficult question to ask, perhaps. But do you believe that the Russian opposition may have a slight image problem in Europe currently? Because we think of recent examples of the Pavlensky case in the Griveaux affair in Paris, the Russian activist who leaked nude images of the French mayoral candidate. We think of Pussy Riot sometimes with the destruction they did in European churches. And even Navalny, to a certain extent, has a bit of a bad reputation in Europe. Do you believe that
I'm
this is
sorry,
something?
something happening with the sound. I don't know.
So can you hear? Not can you hear me? Okay, is that better?
Yeah, that it breaks a little bit.
I think
Maybe
it
I
might.
would re-log in and
Yes, we could try that. If we just
Yeah.
give me 1 second. Sorry about this. Any? Oh, we will be joined back shortly by Ilya. I'm sorry about the connection. It's quite a long distance connection, and it's quite expected that we might have some interference. If you do put any questions for Ilya, please make sure to put them in the comments, and we will come to them at the end, and we'll have a Q&A session, and your comments will come up on the screen, and we'll be able to see them. Hopefully, we'll be joined back by Ilya shortly. In the meantime, I will talk a little bit about some of the future events that we might have with the EPP. In around about 2 weeks, we're scheduled to be joined by a senior former member of the British Diplomatic Service, who is very much involved in e-democracy, and he will talk to us on the subject of coronavirus and its impact upon democracies. And in the future, we may be joined by an MEP who is currently in the European Parliament, to get his insight into some interesting topics. I can't discuss that quite yet, but we have this posted on our Facebook page very shortly. I'm going to check with Ilya where he is. My apologies. I do apologize. I think, is my audio okay? I hope you can hear me okay on my end. I believe it's through Ilya's connection. Hopefully we'll hear back from Ilya very shortly. Whilst I'm here and we have some time, I will also talk about our membership. We are a community-based organization, so if you go to our website, which is available on our Facebook page, you can sign up to become a free member. Being a free member, you get to see all our events in the planning. It's all worked collaboratively, so you'll see the speakers that we are in conversation with. You will be able to view content that normal people would not. So you can really take part in this organization. And also, we will have annual AGMs where we can shape the future of this organization. And if you're a member, you are automatically invited to come and join, to run in positions to contribute to our organization. So do consider signing up. It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. I'm hoping we have Ilya back shortly. I think he's joining us again now. My apologies. Oh, yeah. There's always technical hitches. I'm very sorry. This is our first event, and I would have been surprised if everything went flawlessly. Hopefully, Ilya will join us shortly. Here we go. Ilya should be with us any second now. Hopefully, we'll be able to hear him a little bit better. Well, I could see Ilya. I'll add him back on. Hello,
Very much
Ilya. You're
sorry. I
back.
don't know why. Yeah, still the
I'm
sound
not sure. I
is not
think
perfect.
it's still a little crackly, but I think we'll have to bear with.
Yeah.
I will get back to where we were. So I was talking about the image that Europe has of the Russian opposition, and sometimes that isn't particularly positive. Sometimes because we have figures like Pavlensky, who was heavily involved in the scandal in Paris, and then we have organizations such as Pussy Riot. There is a view that the Russian opposition attempts to copy Western liberalism too much. What do you think your solution to this would be?
You see, you are asking a very difficult question because it's a question about the balance between freedom of self-expression, freedom of speech, and this is something that we firmly stand for. The ability of people to express their political, social, and aesthetical views. From the other side, there is a question of political effectiveness and the possibility to came to power. And for example, you mentioned Pussy Riot. That's probably the best example that you can think about. Is I know those girls quite well. They my good friends. They also very much to the left side of the political spectrum. I know them for a very long time and respect them a lot. From another side, when they were doing those event, this action that they undertook to go to protest to the church, it was very much clear that it would not be accepted well by the overwhelming majority of the society, because even those who like atheists, and Russian society is predominantly atheist. We have only 5% people which are like true believers and regularly go to church, but still a lot of people have a lot of respect for the tradition and the culture and everything. And obviously, this kind of action was seen as the violation of something which is very deep inside the roots of the society. So by then arresting them and inviting, so to say, the bulk of the opposition to campaign for Pussy Riot, and that's obviously what everybody did, because we thought that the punishment that was given to girls, obviously, that didn't to a slightest degree match the seriousness of their wrongdoing, but at the same time that created a huge divide between the opposition and the society. And it was very visible. It was played down by the media very effectively. And another example is, for example, LGBT movement. I, in the parliament, in many cases, also was the only person who voted against anti-LGBT laws. So again, my political beliefs are to support all minorities, including this one. But at the same time, when some of the leaders of LGBT movement were trying to do some also street rallies and whatever, they achieved exactly the opposite result than one would expect. They draw a lot of attention to themselves. They provoked media to campaign against them, of course, orchestrated by Kremlin, which is ironically is dominated by gay people, but nonetheless they used it very effectively against the opposition, because they managed to put the equal mark. So opposition are those who are against our traditional values, are against our religion, is against our culture, is for LGBT, for the West, for NATO, like you name it, like all the unpopular things that you would imagine inside the country, that would be in the opposition. Everything that is popular would be with United Russia and Mr. Putin. And of course, I think that when we are again planning our activities and actions, we should not ignore this.
Okay. Would you also classify this problem as a problem between the city centers, which are more and more liberal, especially if you're going to places like St. Petersburg and Moscow, or rather European left, not maybe left-leaning progressive societies, and then provincial Russia, which Putinism survives of provincial Russia? How, with a liberal government, would you reconcile the two very, very different areas of Russia?
Also, you are right on spot with the problem. It definitely exists. And one story is about Moscow, and I would say standalone Moscow. I would not even expand it to all large cities, because, for example, the city where my constituency is, Novosibirsk, is the third largest city in Russia, but it's already very much left-wing rather than neoliberal as Moscow is. St. Petersburg is something in between, and all others are, way more conservative than those three. And of course, there is a big problem of miscommunication between the Moscow-based opposition and the region. And I was always complaining that the opposition should be dominated by the regional leaders, because they would be able to come across and deliver the message to all others, to the rest of the country. And they're usually more radical, more committed. They have less to lose. And that's why they fear less when they are fighting for their goals. But of course, there is now a big contradiction between the position of a very anti-communist center, where all this media anti-Soviet sentiment is very strong, and very much pro-Soviet regions. And they are pro-Soviet not because they liked Gulag, Stalin or repressions, but because they lived better during the Soviet times. Currently, there is a great inequality and disparity within the country in terms of lifestyle of the large cities and the provincial areas. Say the same Novosibirsk that I mentioned in the Soviet times. That was one of the best places to live in the country, despite that it is in Siberia. It's the capital of Siberia. But there was strong industry. It was a capital of science and technology. There was also very robust and developed agriculture around the city. Is just one thing that the province didn't have is oil and gas. Now all the areas around, which in the past were just an industrial producing areas, but from where people love to go to the same Novosibirsk to live, they are now rich, but they don't have that much people in those areas. They benefit from natural resources extraction, but where you have the real industry and the real science and the real culture and the real services and the small businesses and whatever, they all are greatly depressed. Of course, that generates a large push towards leftist economic beliefs, but they have been totally rejected by Moscow, who is right now capitalizing on the profits from all the country. Moscow right now has, say, 10% of population in Russia, but controls almost 70% of national GDP. And of course, it's not fair, and it's not that Moscow produces that GDP. It's just that all the companies who are exploiting regions are being incorporated in Moscow. So it's been converted into a real colonial style system where there is metropoly which is Moscow, and the colony, which is the rest of the country. Of course, it creates a huge gap between political beliefs of the regions and of Muscovites, and Kremlin is playing skillfully on this division.
I agree. I'm going to switch now to Russia in relation to the world. Is my microphone making this noise? Sorry. Is my sound quality okay on? Do you hear me okay? The crackling is getting worse, I think. I'm sorry about the crackling. So we're looking at Russia and its place in the world. We have seen a rise in authoritarianism coming out of Central Europe and Eastern Europe now. Do you see Russia as instrumental in fomenting this, or do you believe that people are starting to be inspired by the authoritarianism of Russia? And equally, can we say by this measure that Russia has been inspired by China, with Xi Jinping declaring himself as president for life?
I don't think that neither Russia nor China can actually inspire anything. Russian elites, I think it's and Kremlin, Putin, and his cronies, it's a common misperception to take them as a kind of devoted imperialists. They are mere crooks. They are exporting corruption. They are exporting injustice. And they usually, as Putin once proclaimed during his speech in the United Nations, I remember it was very characteristic episode. It was Obama speaking right before him, and Obama was saying that United States would work as a supporter of all freedom fighters and of all liberated movements across the world, everybody who is fighting for their freedom and justice. And then Putin was coming to the floor and saying, and Russia would support everybody who is upholding the law in their countries. And obviously, it was a message to all different dictators because they always design the laws for themselves, as Putin does, and that's actually what he is trying to do right now with amendments to his constitution. So Putin is, as being a genuinely conservative guy, he is proclaiming, so everybody who wants to uphold the order as it is designed would have our support. And that's what he really does. But he cannot support any insurgents. Mm-hmm. He is trying to create a mess inside Western politics. But basically, his main objective is to send the message that you guys are not nor better than we are. With this, for example, famous story or ill-famous story of Russian collusion in U.S. elections. If there was a collusion, of course it was, and it's well proven that it was. Whether the collusion was to support the elections of Mr. Trump, this is something I don't believe. I think it was targeted to create a chaos, because I think that Kremlin's calculation was that Mrs. Clinton was going to win, and they wanted to give Trump all the tools to actually rebel against Clinton's victory and to create a political chaos within the country. And Russia today, as the main tool of Kremlin's external propaganda, they are trying to highlight all the flaws in Western societies. Look how they are taken, for example, the current riots in the United States, and they were trying to inspire the same type thing before on different racial and other very fair, by the way. I
think it's interesting to note equally. It's interesting to note equally that the Russian media campaigns, they use both sides. We have Redfish on one hand, which promotes a very leftist opposition in Europe, and then also Sputnik and RT, who provide quite a right-wing and often racist view on things. So it's interesting with your theory that they are purely sowing chaos. There's no agenda within their
Yeah,
goals.
they support both flanks. They support radical left and radical right, with, by the way, important difference, because radical right usually are willing to be organizationally aligned with Moscow, and they are ready to take financing and everything like ultra right in the US does, and say AFD in Germany, or Front National in France, or many others. A lot of examples in Eastern Europe. So ultra right, they are organizationally aligned with Kremlin. Radical left, they usually don't. But nevertheless, if say Russia Today or other media or troll factories are highlighting their activities, who would protest?
I also wanted to ask on the subject of imperialism and maybe the identity of Russia, whether you believe that Russia is starting to abandon its Western identity. It no longer associates with Europe. Instead, it's looking to the Middle East, it's looking to the Far East, it's looking towards China and other nations. Do you believe that there's a gradual shift away from this identification with the rest of Europe?
No, here I don't believe there would be any shift like this. I actually think the other way around. What Putin is saying all the time is that we are more Europeans than you guys are. That it's those liberal rulers of Europe who have forgotten their roots, submerged in the world of LGBT, allowed all those immigrants to come from Arab countries, African countries, with destroying the traditions of Christianity and the white people, all that kind of stuff. That's what Putin is saying. So from one side, yes, it's very popular in Russia to say that we are a separate civilization, and I think to a larger degree that's true. But we are a separate European civilization. And every day, if you come to the mirror and look at yourself, what I'm doing every day, I don't see Chinese there. I don't see Arab there. I see European there. And our ethical platform is the same platform of the Bible and of European Renaissance. It's not a platform of Quran or Confucius or any other great and honorable historical books or people. That's a reality. And to my mind, of course, Russia, European Union, United States would always be a part of the same civilizational platform, and I don't think that Putin is challenging it. I think that he's trying to be the anchor, the light for those who believe in the history and in the tradition, for all white Christian conservatives across the globe. That's his objective, and as we see by the results of the voting in both Europe and the United States, it's a significant portion of Western societies. Actually, at least a half of Western societies are on the same platform, and that's what Putin is trying to capitalize on.
Mm-hmm. And this will probably be one of the most difficult questions to ask. You can't tell the future. I know it's it's a complex situation in Russia, but do you personally believe that Russia could ever be progressive?
Of course, obviously it will. In 1917, it was the most progressive country in the world, and I think that those times would come again. Russians, in general, Russian society is very much like that stick that you bend a lot, and you can bend it a lot, but at one point it would break and would hit you right in your head. And the more you bend, the harder would be the outcome. And I'm afraid that what Putin is currently doing is actually programming another very violent and bloody revolution in the country. I hope it would not be that like that. But again, the more you bend it, the harder it would go back.
Why would you say that there is such pessimism among many opposition platforms? Do you see progress being made in Russia? Do you think that this is something that people should abandon this kind of pessimistic view that they're under the boot of the Kremlin and that they're helpless to the changes, or would you say that Russia is slowly moving in a positive direction?
Well, one reason is that it's obvious that the night is the darkest right before the dawn, and right now it's very dark, and that's the reality. Second thing is that Putin is very skillful manipulator, and he has managed to build a lot of popular support around him, not because people genuinely like him, but simply because they don't see an alternative. It was just recently when we saw another sociological poll, which was done by Levada Center, one of relatively independent pollsters company in Russia, which indicated that when people are being asked whom do you trust, Putin is getting like 27, 29% of spontaneous trust. So it's still number one position in the country, but it's just a quarter of the population. But when the same people would be asked whom would you vote on the next presidential elections, Putin would get already around 60%. And what does it mean? It's just that people don't see the alternative. So it's not that they like Putin, they are no longer in love with him, but there's simply nobody else. And they fear a lot that whoever may come to replace him would actually lead the country back into 1990s to awful times of Gorbachev and Yeltsin, which they definitely don't want to. And Putin is reinstating these fears all the time on the national TV. And because he controls it, so he is extremely successful in this regard. And that's becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, because when like you, as you being in the opposition, you also read the polls. A lot of my liberal friends tend to say, okay, so that's the wrong nation. You know, it's an embedded in Russian mindset, to pray for the Tsar, to be loyal to Putin, and we better leave. And they start to emigrate, thus decreasing the number of active people who can actually fight. And when they even see the opportunities for a positive political action, like the one which is coming actually at the end of this month, on 1st of July, we would have a referendum against the constitutional, so for Putin for us against the constitutional amendments, which would allow Putin to stay in power forever. A lot of opposition people, they start saying, we will boycott them. Okay, you will boycott them. Whom you would help with this? You would only help Putin. Putin is saying, thank you very much, guys. And I actually think that he is utilizing all the connections through the security forces, all his agents of influence within the opposition, to actually spread this fears that it's all useless. And guys, if you're going to vote against, please stay at home. But we see an example, for example, in Chavez Venezuela, when even genuinely popular Chavez, when he did try to extend his presidential terms and declared a similar referendum like Putin is doing right now, he was defeated. And there are many other examples like this. You can be popular, but that doesn't mean that people would like you staying in power forever. So you need always to take political action. You need always to fight. And at one point of time, the stick would break.
Do you believe that there's any risk to Putin's rule from within his own inner circle? Putin's well known for playing off different oligarchs at a time with different promises to keep quite a loyal circle. And as you've mentioned earlier, he hates traitors. He doesn't stand traitors. But these people who are closest to him, these most powerful oligarchs, hold the most power. Do you reckon there could ever be a time where a disgruntled oligarch creates a new political movement or creates fractures in the United Russia Party?
Also, it's a very good question. The current system that exists in Russia with oligarchs, it's all been based on the privatization that was taking place in the country in the mid of 90s. And the privatization, which was actually designed by many people who now associate themselves with the liberal opposition. The same Boris Nemtsov was one of the architects of that privatization system, and many others. And this privatization was not economically driven; it was way more politically driven. It was actually to consciously create this class of oligarchs, large businesses, who would at the same time control media, control political circles, and control a large number of people in the real economy, which would be the foundation of the regime. And when Putin came to power, what he told to those guys is, okay, so I am not taking out what you guys have. I am actually would be supporting you. But you should make sure that you do not interfere with my approach towards politics. You shouldn't mess around. And the only guy who actually was staying on his own independent position, Mr. Khodorkovsky, he illegally prosecuted to give an example to all others. And people understood. They took the point, and right now they are extremely loyal to Mr. Putin because they have a lot to lose. The only way to break their ranks is actually to produce them with a carrot, which would be sweeter than what they actually have right now in the country. But right now we see only the stick in the West. But the stick is rather making them to consolidate around Putin, because he's kind of the only person who can bring them something positive, and that's what he does. Whoever has been sanctioned by the West, he gives additional government appropriations and government assistance, obviously at the expense of ordinary Russians. But that doesn't matter; they benefit. And that obviously is not exactly what can provoke them to rebel and speak against Putin. Here, actually, if we want to achieve the split inside Russian elites, that's probably the only place where West can actually play the role and work with those people and ensure that some of them would flip sides and start fighting against the current regime. Unfortunately, it's not happening. Everything that West was doing so far was rather counterproductive in this regard.
And has the sanctions affected this at all? If the sanctions are making business harder, it's harder to do business with Europe from Russia. Do you believe that if sanction stimulus was given to some people to break ranks, for example, if they follow certain lines, that they would receive an incentive in Europe? Is this the way to go, or is this just bribery and we shouldn't consider it?
Well, to my mind, again, the sanctions, the way they were implemented, and I spoke many times about that loud, is counterproductive and not helpful. The sanctions consist of two parts. One part is so-called sectoral economic sanctions, and they have proven to be counterproductive everywhere in the world. They have in no cases during world history, sanctions against Cuba or sanctions against Iran or sanctions against North Korea or anything else. None of them actually helped to change the regime, because as the result of economic sanctions, you always consolidate the society around the leaders of the country, because you actually sustain their usual key message to their nation is that, you see, we are surrounded by enemies and we have to stand by the chief, and we need to protect our leadership because that's our only friends who are coordinating the resistance against those bastards.
Would you say then now that these sanctions actually encouraged Russia to work towards autarky and to self-reliance and not relying on markets? If anything, it made them stronger against any other sanctions.
Well, of course, those sanctions, they kind of strip Russia from its future, because it does not allow Russia to access, say, foreign lending, foreign technologies, expand foreign markets, etc., etc., etc. But it's not affecting today Russia. And even if it does, we say restrictions on certain food deliveries that actually help Kremlin to justify, you see, the galloping prices is not because we invaded Ukraine as what is the real reason for this process, but it's because the bloody Obama, bloody Trump, bloody Merkel is because they have acted against us. So it allows to totally blame the wrong people.
Oh, we lost Ilya, and Ilya is coming back. We lost you for a second.
Okay, we're back.
We're back.
Yes. Okay. And what can potentially be way more productive is so-called personal sanctions. The personal sanctions, which are targeted not against the country, the nation, but against individuals who consist the leadership, the power circles. Of course, they make those guys think about their own personal future. But the question is that so far the approach to apply those sanctions would be to actually cherry pick the certain guys. It's right now like, I believe 200 or 300 people altogether who were sanctioned by the United States, and like 100 something who were sanctioned by Europe. And most of those guys are very low-level managers in the field who have no assets in the West and are not interested, so they're literally not affected. They're even proud sometimes that they have been sanctioned, because that would allow them to build a better career inside Russia. And among important people, among those oligarchs around Putin's close associates, I don't know, like, would be a handful of those guys who were affected. All others were not. I remember when I was voting against the war with Ukraine, a lot of my fellow members of State Duma were coming to me, and they were like jealous. They were saying, you bastard, you would be clean and nice, you would be still allowed to travel, and what should we do with our villas and mansions, and our kids which are in the West? We were forced to work like we did, but now we would face the consequences, and you would come clean. And what did happen? Among all the members of State Duma who voted for that war, less than 10 were actually sanctioned, among 600 altogether, which were in both chambers of Russian parliament. So after that, they were vice versa. They were coming to me and say, you would be sanctioned inside Russia, and you see us, we're doing great. You should be more smarter than what you were. What is the message that has been sent to Russian elites? And even those who were actually picked among those large Russian businesses, who were picked, Mr. Deripaska, who is part of a former Yeltsin establishment and who is not close to Mr. Putin at all, and everybody were taken that this punishment was just because the West wanted to redistribute the aluminum sales across the world, so that the motivation was not political, but it was unfair competition. To overcome this, you would need to be consistent, and you would need to be say, okay, so we are sanctioning all members of United Russia, or we're sanctioning all members of Russian government, all members of the presidential staff. So we are sanctioning those who really are the policy makers, who are really instrumental for the war, for the aggression, for the robbery of Russian people. That would be popular both within the country, and that would provide an incentive for Russian elites to actually rethink their behavior. But that never happened.
I'll ask my final question, and then we'll take some questions from the chat. My final question would be, do you believe that Russia's expansionism is more political? The idea of trying to reform the Soviet bloc, retake control over the areas they used to have influence in, or was it economic? Because there was a lot of the areas that they've seized, and especially the cold conflicts that they started, do not provide much material wealth to Russia. In fact, they're a net cost. So why do you think they're still so insistent on expanding?
Because I think it's neither. I think that the reason for those expansionist aggressive policies is internal political situation in Russia. Is Putin's reign is has no substance any longer. The economic progress that Russia experienced during 2000s is totally expired, and Russians do not anymore see any positive future, any hopes for positive social economic development. Of course, it could have happened way better in the past because if not corruption, if not wasting all the wealth that was coming from oil and gas revenue, the Russians would have already be living way better than they are currently. But still, there was progress, and that was a stark contrast with what was happening in the 90s, and that is the reason for Putin's popularity, is because Russians were living better and better. But right now, it's no longer the case. And when you have no bread, you have to provide people with cannons. You have to provide them with shows, and that's exactly what is happening. And that's why I think that Belarus, for example, is very much in danger, because things with Ukraine are not developing any longer, but Putin needs to do something else to keep people entertained and keep them feel that they are returning their might and self-dignity and respect and everything, and how they say, reunification, but actually annexation of Belarus can be something that may be coming.
Brilliant. I'm going to pass over now to some questions that we have from the audience. I'll flash up on the screen. If we'd like to have the first one. Oh, it's quite a long one. Hello, Ilya. I have a small question when it comes to the state of Russian democracy, specifically one event linked to it. What are your thoughts on Albert Razin's demonstration for minority language rights through self-immolation? What impact has it had on the dialogue, if any?
Also, it's a very important question, and I always, being in the parliament, supported all the minority languages in Russia. During 1990s, there was a lot of positive developments in this regards. Obviously, the best time for all minority ethnicities and nationalities in Russia was shortly after the revolution of 1917. That's where Russian language has lost its monopoly, and a lot of other languages were supported and developed. Ukrainian, for example, and Belarusian and all others. Right now, a lot of nations in different post-Soviet space say exactly the opposite thing, but they are simply wrong. That was developing at that time, even sometimes forcefully developing. Putin is trying to reunificate the country, and that creates a lot of tensions. To my mind, to my personal experience, I saw a lot of tensions like this in Yakutia, for example, who made a giant leap forward during 90s in terms of establishing their national identity and culture and self-awareness. In Tatarstan, obviously, in many states of northern Caucasus, and obviously I totally oppose it because it actually creates a lot of grounds for future dissolution of the country, which I definitely don't want to. You know, we will not obviously keep anybody by force within the country, but still I think I believe in the world without borders and where people live as one global nation, and isolationist tendencies are totally against my personal beliefs. But sometimes, as Lenin said, to be united, you need to be separated first.
Brilliant. And I think we'll pass to the next question. We have one from Philip. Is a revolution from below the only way to influence Russia's political structure?
I think so. I wouldn't say that I'm afraid so, because to my mind, revolution can be a very positive thing that awakens people and liberates them. And I think that actually people would start value their freedom and their achievements only when they were paid for during this kind of revolutionary process. I see it, for example, in the modern days Ukraine, where basically they have twice experienced pretty much the same revolution in 2004, which was totally bloodless, and in 2014, where the blood was spilled. And obviously the outcome of the revolution of 2014 is way more sustainable, and exactly because there were victims of that revolution, so that Ukrainians are taking their achievements seriously. Obviously, I would very much want to defeat Putin through the elections and peacefully and constitutionally, but I very much afraid that what he has created inside the country makes it totally impossible.
Very well. If we could have another question, please. This is from Alec. What are Ilya's thoughts on Putin's desperation to install Haftar into power in Libya? Is it for internal approval from the public or the political class?
You know, I am not a great specialist in Libya's politics. Of course, I am tracking all the events, and as you're probably aware, General Haftar, for a very long time, firstly, he was Gaddafi's affiliate, but then he was an outright agent of the West. And coordinated his activities a lot with the same CIS and U.S. government, CIA and the same U.S. government and everybody. So to my mind, he cannot be taken as a reliable partner by anyone, especially by Russia, who is pretty far away and is not very much a sustainable and reliable partner for Haftar himself. So to my mind, when I am observing all the developments there, I see the only rationale is, again, to try to provoke as much chaos as possible, to disrupt the Western policies as much as possible. The same basically thing as what is happening in Syria. What are the strategic interests of Russia in Syria? Obviously none. is just a disruption for Western policies in the region, is the possibility to get a leverage over the inflow of migrants into continental Europe, and to obtain a negotiating word when talking to Merkel or Macron or other people like this. And I think that with Libya, it's more or less the same. I think that Putin is trying to just gain as many negotiation grounds as possible to get to the results which are really important for him, like the control over Ukraine.
If we could have another question. This is from Catalina. In case you've heard, Ida Mujadayev, the Crimean Tatar journalist, was declared a terrorist. Do you think he deserves such a label, or is he really a very, very radical person who is a threat?
Well, Aider is my close friend, whom I know for ages, and we like to sit together, to drink with him, and I like to be in his shows on Crimean Tatar television, which I'm doing regularly. Even this week I was on one. And
is he dangerous?
It doesn't mean that he's no terrorist. You know, I probably have different terrorists in my acquaintances as well. But no, I don't think, of course, that he is one. I think that he's a very devoted fighter for the freedom of his nation against the occupation. To my mind, he sometimes is too radical to my taste, as aesthetically, in what he is saying. But obviously, he's not falling under any definition of a terrorist. He's just a journalist with a very bold and very well pronounced political position.
Brilliant. If we have another one. To Ilya, do you think Boris Yeltsin ruined Russia in the 90s?
I think he ruined the society. He created modern days Russia, but I don't think that's the country who should have been created. I think that by shooting down the legitimate parliament in 1993, he actually created the foundation for Putinism. And to my mind, Putinism is a direct evolution of Yeltsinism. And he could, I think, fix those problems of his reign if he would allow in 1996 the justice to happen and Mr. Zyuganov to win the elections. Because it would have happened very much like it was happening in Poland, where very popular Wałęsa was coming to power in 1990, but then in 1995 he was defeated by President Kwasniewski, who was former member of former Polish Communist Party. It was called Workers' Party. Doesn't matter. But still, it's a descendant of the former Communist Party. But nothing dangerous happened, and it was actually those socialists who made Poland join European Union in 2002. It was a socialist prime minister and a member of this former Communist Party who have signed an accord with the European Union of joining the alliance. The same thing with NATO, by the way. And I think that would exactly what would have happened in Russia. Yeah, maybe some developments would not have been that rapid, but people would understand that they are in power and that there is democracy.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Ilya, are you there? Have we lost Ilya? I believe we have. We have a few more questions to pose him, so I hope we can get him back. I'll give Ilya a few seconds, and I might be able to kick him off and invite him back. I'm sorry for all the technical glitches. I'm going to very quickly kick Ilya from the studio. I'm removing him very shortly, and he should be back any second now. Whilst he is rejoining, I will actually take the question if we could get it on the screen from Danny, I believe. Hi. So the think tank, the goal of our organization, let me just share the link for Ilya to come back. The goal of our organization ultimately is to increase the political discourse in Europe. We are not affiliated with any party. We have no party affiliations. We work across borders. We will have speakers from countries all across Europe. Our idea is to de-escalate politics, to have these conversations with thinkers from radically different opinions. We will have left-leaning figures one week, right-leaning figures another. We want to open up the discourse. We are rejoined by Ilya. Hello, Ilya.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. My phone got overheated. You know, probably our discussion was too hot. No, Mr. Putin is thinking that
the microphone quality is very bad from your microphone currently.
The microphone?
Yeah, it's not very good.
1 second. I'm with my just regular.
I apologize.
Yeah, just 1 second. I will then.
Of course.
I will pick up the earphones and it will be better. 1 second.
Okay, no problem. So I'll carry on talking about what I was saying. We invite speakers from the country. The idea as well is to create new political discourse, new political ideas by synthesizing ideas from both the right and the left. So we promote political syncretism, which is we want to try and bring the right and the left back together and try and create new syncretic governments. And we are very keen to hear from figures who represent alternative politics, outsider politics, activists, who work to bring the non-platform parties into the platform. So that is the think tank goal of our organization. We're very young, so this is for the moment we mostly just enjoy hosting live streams with thinkers, and we love to have our viewers come and be exposed to new ideas and new thinkers. I'm going to also quickly flash on the screen whilst I'm here, or if my colleague could do so, our PayPal.
Is it good now?
Not. It's okay. I can hear you, but it's just a little bit a bit garbled.
It's garbled. So.
Yeah.
I don't know what's happening. You know, it was I garbled when I heard. Just 1 second.
We will have 1 or 2 more questions from Ilya, and hopefully he'll manage to fix his microphone and answer some of your brilliant questions.
Yeah. Is it any way better?
Not really. It's a bit loud and not very good quality. I'm not sure what's going on.
Loud. Just 1 second. To make it not loud. Is it better now?
No, not really. But I think we can try and soldier on with the microphone that we have.
Sorry for this.
No problem. So we have a question from Pavel. Do you think that Navalny is truly capable of having a positive impact on Russia if he is to be elected president, for example, to fully rewrite the constitution to fit the European standards?
Unfortunately, I don't think so. I think that Navalny is identical to Mr. Putin. Unfortunately, I think that Navalny's goal is to replace Putin and basically to exercise the same power, just with different goals and different direction. But it's very much the same style. Among the opposition leaders, Mikhail Khodorkovsky definitely wants to make it different. Khodorkovsky wants to abolish the position of the president and create a full-scale parliamentary democracy. Mr. Gudkov is very much on the same position, myself is on the same position, but everybody who is with Navalny they are very much towards the strong leadership. And I think that's exactly what needs to be avoided in the future Russia.
Mm-hmm. We have we'll do two more questions and then we will call it a day. David Plaster wants to know about how you took over your local government with activists when they were seen to be corrupt.
Hello, David. Nice to see yourself and your question. I think that actually the question with the local government is the easiest, because the local government is something which is the closest to people, and that's where people always see what's going on, and they see who's corrupt, and they see the direct consequence of their actions. And even in modern days Russia is a very obviously diverse country. We see a lot of local governments which are doing pretty well. We see that people, even under all the falsifications and violations during the election process, that they from time to time manage to elect local mayors and local city councils, and they are trying to change the situation for better. They are not capable of changing the system, and they are anyway controlled by the central authorities in terms of financing and in terms of police and everything. But they are trying to do their best for their local constituents, and I think that actually after the change would happen, we need, like in Ukraine, make this decentralization campaign and give as much power as possible to the local authorities, and let them compete with each other.
Brilliant. And should we get our last question? Oh, it's quite a long one. This is from Katerina again. If Russian opposition is worthy of support and it wants to portray itself as partners of Ukraine, why do people like Sobchak say that the Crimean question should be solved not by giving back the annexed territory, but by vote? Is that really opposition or just pro-Russian liberal imperialism?
Again, it's a good question. I think we shouldn't take people oversimplistic. There are different layers of political beliefs and alignments which are interlapping one with another. And it can be the same people who declare that they are liberal, meaning that usually that they are neoliberal in terms of their economic program and social beliefs, but at the same time they can be racist. We saw it during the current process in the United States, where the, unfortunately, majority of Russian opposition-minded people declared that they totally hate those rioters because they are leftist, communist, bloody looters and everything, and expressed a lot of racist remarks. The same thing is about imperialism. Again, a person can be against Putin, but share his approach in terms of imperialist desires. But I wouldn't also say that it's common for all Russians to be imperialists. And again, if we look at the polls, etc., even in the highest point of hysteria during the annexation of Crimea, the society was split 80 to 20, which means even with all the propaganda, 20% was against it. And I personally, when I was doing meetings in Novosibirsk before this propaganda has started, and when we were just deciding how should I vote in the parliament, and I was talking to my constituents, I would see that usually people were split half and half. And that's more or less, to my mind, a realistic view of people who are genuinely liberal and genuinely conservative. And it's the same distribution as, for example, in the United States. Again, if we see on this Black Lives Matter protests, we see that half of population is for and half is against. So it's exactly the same distribution. There's nothing special for the Russian opposition and the Russian society. Obviously, we are back to the point where, again, I cited several times and deliberately have done so, Lenin, during my answers to your question. This phrase that is currently extremely popular in Ukraine, that the Russian Democrat ends where Ukrainian question starts, that's actually the phrase that was originally said by Vladimir Lenin to his allies and friends and fellow members of Bolshevik party, because the Bolshevik party was the one which actually was for Ukraine's independence, which is now largely forgotten in the modern day Ukraine. So it's a very difficult question, and this is the position which is extremely fluid in the society, because it's so easy to manipulate people, to inspire this false national dignity feeling, to make people united around the leadership playing by their patriotic beliefs and feelings. It would pass.
Lovely. Well, I think that we'll end the event there. I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about if you've got any projects you're working on, anything coming up you'd like to announce, or a book or something.
Even myself?
Yourself, yes. Do you have any projects that you'd like to advertise, or any votes, any movements or organizations that you're working with?
Well, friends, I am really grateful for everyone who was with us, and I'm really sorry for technical difficulties. Experiencing the first attempt to do this. Next time we'll definitely do better. What I call everybody to is not to listen to myths. Look in the essence of things. Things are always not what they seem. And in the modern days of propaganda and of different information bubbles in the social networks, it's so easy to be confused and to try to fall for easy solutions and easy answers that makes our vision totally clouded and confused. So I hope that with my answers I managed to bring your attention to some of those myths and common beliefs. So let's keep in touch. My Facebook is always open for everyone. If you want to answer me questions, this event I will post on my Facebook page, and you can ask me questions. I would be glad to answer those which I didn't answer during this event.
Ilya, I'd like to thank you very much, and I hope that we can bring you back on some point to discuss maybe another topic that's dear to you, maybe Ukraine or business. Thank you very much. I'd like to finish just by saying that, again, we operate entirely on donations. So to cover our expenses and cover our costs, we accept purely donations. So if you feel like you've taken something away from this podcast, from this discussion, please consider making a donation of as little as £1 to our organisation. And on that, Ilya, I will let you go, and I'll end the live stream here. Thank you, everybody, for following on Facebook, on YouTube, and I shall share this video through several pages. And I would like to thank our hosts again at KCL and UCL. And thank you very much. Bye-bye now.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.